Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody is staying cool, safe, and healthy. And welcome to July's webinar. The topic for today is the future of Drupal and web content publishing in the government. Our speaker today is Suzanne Degacheva. She is the co-founder and Drupal practice lead at Evolving Web. So before we begin and before she speaks, I always have to do some housekeeping. We are Drupal for Gov. We are a community of open source advocates who love all things open source, especially Drupal. We have a yearly conference, which we, for the first time in a while that we haven't had, Drupal GovCon. We are currently in the planning phase of figuring out how we can have another event this year, maybe on a smaller scale, but just communication will be coming later about that. We're still in the planning phase of that. We also do global training days, have training days. Hopefully we can do some of that more in the future. Gov Summit at DrupalCon North America, and of course these webinars that you're attending now. If you are interested in contacting us, if you want to be a presenter for one of our webinars, please reach out. We have our email at drupalforgov@gmail.com, as well as our Slack channels, and we are on Twitter. A special shout out going to Promet Source. They are our webinar sponsor for July. They do Drupal development, igniting digital possibilities for public sector websites with inclusive, open source, and award-winning website solutions. So if you're interested, check out Promet Source. Also, if you miss a webinar, please visit our YouTube channel immediately after our webinars. We upload these videos to YouTube where you can watch again. And also we have the drupalforgov.us/webinars website, our website. And you can go there, and after each webinar, we post the information there as well. And let's get to the good part. Today's speaker, I mentioned Suzanne. She's a co-founder and Drupal practice lead at Evolving Web. She serves as community-elect member of the Drupal Association Board and has provided in-depth training and thought leadership to the Drupal community. So I'm excited to hear you speak. Thank you. I'm going to hand it over to you, Susie.
Thank you. Just a fact check, I used to be on the board of the Drupal Association, and I'm no longer, but I'm involved in the Promote Drupal initiative and lead that. So that's what I'm up to these days. Yeah, I'll just share my screen here. And we'll get started. So I'm excited to talk about this topic. I've presented on similar things a few times about the future of content publishing, the future of Drupal, and excited to talk about it today in the government context. So I've already been introduced, which is really nice, but I'll just mention I've been doing Drupal for about 15 years and have that whole time played many different roles as a Drupal themer and developer, leading projects, as a trainer, and now I'm involved more in UX and content strategy. So it's kind of fun because I've gotten to see Drupal from many perspectives and its capabilities, but also work with clients at different levels. And a bit about Evolving Web, if you've never heard of us before, we're an agency that specializes in Drupal. We do a lot of work in the government context, but we also work with lots of universities and other types of public sector and nonprofit organizations. So our reach is pretty broad. We've done some work with the US Senate and San Francisco government, as well as other governments in the United States and Canada. So I want to start off the presentation by putting things into context a bit and thinking about how web publishing has evolved. So, so fasten your seatbelts. We're gonna go back in time a bit. And when I started, working in the web and, building websites and doing things, we used to talk about the value of using a content management system. And we still have clients who aren't using a content management system, but it's more rare. I think most people have gotten, are convinced by the fact that, yes, we need a system to manage content. We can't just be editing HTML pages. And so there's this huge value in using a system like Drupal. I think that we can all recognize that, having content stored in a logical way so that many people can edit it, and not just people who are technical or people who have a training in HTML and get like keys to the kingdom, are able to make updates. And then after I'd used Drupal for a few years, we started talking about creating platforms, and we talked about Drupal websites in particular as a platform. We're going to create a platform for you to manage your content. And I think what we were really trying to do there was to distinguish the capabilities of Drupal from other CMSs that might be more limited. And so what defines a platform? What makes it a platform instead of a website? So you might be thinking of the fact that maybe with something like Drupal, you can integrate the content that you're managing in your content management system with other tools. So it's a little bit more integrated than just a website that's isolated and self-contained. And we might also think of a platform as having more than one purpose. Maybe there's a front end that is public facing, but there's maybe also a private section. So something that's a little bit more multifaceted than just what we think of as a static website. And now these days, when we talk about the web, there's players out there who are thinking big, and they're thinking, okay, well, now we don't want to build just websites or platforms or CMSs. What we really want to talk about is digital experience platforms. And I think often what this buzzword or terminology is trying to get at is that people are using the web in a different way. There's we're not just using content through a browser on our laptop. We're also using content that comes through social media, or that comes through other channels. We download an app, or we get content updates in Slack. And so this idea of being larger, that the experience is larger than just what we see online, is what this term is getting at. And so all of this is really interesting, but it puts this emphasis on technology. It puts this emphasis on, okay, we have to be everywhere. We have to have a system that allows us to integrate with everything. And I think sometimes this distracts us from the core of what we're trying to do, which is often to deliver content. And it takes some of the attention away sometimes from the content itself. And so what I like to talk about when I'm talking about, whether you want to call it a CMS or a platform or a DXP, I like to try and put the focus back on the content strategy. And I think that when we're working in web publishing, sometimes we're thinking, okay, well, this press release has to get out the door, and here's all this technology we can connect to do it 5 different ways. And we put less thought into our content strategy sometimes, just because there's all these other things that are asking for our attention. And so I think that today I want to talk about how to orient web publishing more around content, and how, if that's what you're trying to do, and I think for government organizations, a lot of us are trying to do this, then I think Drupal is this great platform. It has a lot of benefits, and there's a lot of ways we can use it to really leverage that content strategy strength that it has. So first of all, I think putting content strategy first implies a lot of things, and it's not all technology related. First, if we're thinking about content strategy, we're usually trying to prioritize user needs. So whenever we start a conversation, whether it's a new project we're starting or a new kind of content or a new feature we're adding, we think first about what users want, because our strategy is usually connected to getting people connected to content. We're also trying to create a platform, but maybe it's something that allows us to focus on adapting and personalizing and translating our content. So we have to think about all of these different aspects of how our content needs to be, how it needs to be used in the system. We often want to integrate it with other services. So DXP maybe is a useful way of thinking about that, but thinking about it more strategically from the user perspective, like where is this content going to be most useful? How can we make sure that it's portable and that it's structured? And how can we make sure that it's compliant? And compliance isn't just for compliance sake, but something that we want to do so that the content is more available, again, coming back to users, so that we can get content more easily into the hands of the people who actually need it. And so, yeah, when you're going to build a platform that really prioritizes content strategy, you need a platform, you need some technology there, but you also need people. And I think this is also something that is important to prioritize. So if we really care about content strategy and making sure that our what we're doing when we're publishing content is getting the content into the hands of the user, we really have to think about the role that content editors play. And I think sometimes we assume, work on lots of projects, and I know that sometimes we just assume like, oh yeah, it's a system that you can edit, there's some user roles, we'll just take care of that at the end of the project, and you set up a few roles. And most of us here probably have seen the page on the Drupal backend where you can add roles, you can set up all the permissions, it's very granular, and we think, oh yeah, Drupal does that, it's going to take care of it. But if we're thinking more strategically about how to improve content, I think we really need to think about the roles that content editors play, and it might be more than one role. And in the context of government, there's often, we're often working with rather large websites that have a whole team of publishers. I've done Drupal trainings, at the Canadian government where there's 50 people, a team of 50 people managing content on one site. And that could be even a higher number, especially if you have people who are doing it in a part-time capacity and they're contributing to content publishing. So I think when I was sort of thinking through the different situations and use cases I've seen situations where content editors are really just treated as, okay, you're entering content. You're maybe not, you're going to have some familiarity, you work for an organization, you know what kind of content it is, but your job is really just to get the content online, get it through the system. There might be some compliance also tied into that, like, okay, I'm going to get it into the system, but I know I have to check to make sure it's tagged correctly or that it complies with certain accessibility guidelines. And then there's another type of content editor that we might think of that's more of a subject matter expert. Somebody who actually is authoring the content. Maybe they're going out and doing research, they're finding what information needs to be included, what do we have to communicate, and they're able to have a bit more authority over the content itself. And so this subject matter expertise is something that a content editor might also be responsible for. And then finally, there's this component of content strategy. And this is something I would challenge you to think about. Do the content editors who use the platform or the website that you're working on, do they have responsibility for content strategy? Are they empowered to do that? Or do they have some training in it? And you might be thinking, well, how does content, what does a content editor do to affect a content strategy? Well, often, we want to have content formatted in a certain way so that users can interpret it well. There might be many options for how text and images are used together that might have a really big impact on what a page says to a user. And these types of decisions, they are done as part of that content editor role. It's a content editor who often has control over how that content looks on a page. And depending on the level of flexibility we give them, they can take more ownership of that. But it really depends on the tools that the platforms we build have. So it's something to consider of how much content strategy is included in this role. And I would argue that it's good to increase that capacity, that empowerment, and good to give those content strategy tools. So if we think about it a different way, maybe really what web publishing is, and all these different nouns you could use, a platform, a website, these are tools that we use to transform content so that it's optimized for users. So often, speaking of, when we think of like a government system, we have all this information about policies, or we have, a whole wealth of press releases and news updates and events that can go out to the public. We have all this information to communicate, and that could be communicated in so many different ways. And the role of our platform here is to transform the content to optimize it for users. So how do we create such a platform that really prioritizes this? So one idea I already mentioned is this idea of empowering communicators and content editors. And empowering people sounds great. We all like this idea of like, yeah, we're gonna train people, we're gonna give them more skills so they can do their job better. But I think it's more than just saying, oh, give people training. We also have to create a set of best practices in an organization around what content strategy it should be. And the one tool that I find really useful for this, and is often missing when I come in on projects and I ask about it, sometimes something people haven't considered, but having a really clear content governance plan can go a long way to getting everybody on the same page about what a website's supposed to do, what content's supposed to do, how it's supposed to connect to users, and what content editors, what their role is in all this. And so to me, a content governance plan should answer a lot of questions about, why do we publish this type of content? Maybe it's maybe we're thinking about some data that we're publishing. We publish all these stats about the impact of our particular department or our organization. So a content governance plan should talk about how often those are updated, who is supposed to be informing those updates, like who are the subject matter experts. It should talk about the purpose of having those there, what that's supposed to do for users. And then it should also talk about how that content should be improved over time, because as we know, Drupal is not there to just publish a static thing. We're supposed to be updating it. It's dynamic. That's the whole point. And so if we are going to update our content, let's say on a yearly basis or a quarterly basis, what are we thinking when we do that? Do we look at some analytics to make sure that the content is, we know how the content's performing, or do we have to, should updates be triggered by actual policy updates or updates to the data itself? So all these details about each type of content that we're putting out there should be made clear in a content governance plan. And when we think about Drupal, and I think about a content governance plan, I think about, well, every content type should be kind of listed out in that plan. We should be thinking about things at that level, but we should also be thinking about things like, well, what are our main types of other content components? So if we have a landing page that has quite a complex structure, who's responsible for the components on that page? Maybe those are driven by paragraphs or blocks. So maybe they're flexible, but who's thinking about updating them, and what is each one for? So of course, this can get quite big, but a content governance plan can kind of be this linchpin for everything else that that your content editors and content strategists are doing. So like I've kind of put out there as an idea, I think content editors are really key to this whole process because they often are playing this role of translation of content to web content. And so the tools that we give them are important. And I think they have different needs. Maybe I'm speaking to you, maybe you're content editors, so maybe you have different needs. And I think when we're creating a platform, when we're setting up Drupal, we need to be thinking about this. Not every website, not every platform needs the same set of tools, but we at least need to consider what's required. So we have to give something that's user-friendly, that people can get oriented around. So having a content overview page, giving a toolbar that's accessible, that has useful links, hiding stuff that's not useful for content editors is also useful for just that general user friendliness. There's a lot of stuff around tools for our publishing workflow. So just being able to approve content, see what's changed, translate, use media properly. There's a whole set of considerations here. Of course, Drupal can allow you to do all of these things. Especially if you're not on Drupal 9 yet or Drupal 8, then you'll benefit a lot from that upgrade because it does a lot of these things much better out of the box. There's also a content compliance component, and this I find tends to need a lot more configuration to make it work. It's not just going to be out of the box. You're going to have to make sure you're designing your templates so that content editors are well supported when they create a piece of content. That it is accessible, that they don't have to be thinking always about everything that they're adding. If we need to have a heading for something to be accessible, then the heading should be required. These types of configuration decisions have a big impact on a user's capability to create compliant content. And then there's a whole set of concerns around flexibility, and I find this one the one that is the biggest question mark. How much control should there be? How much decision making, how much editorial power do you give to a user as they're creating content? And so is there a need to create more marketing style landing pages? What kind of page building tools do we need? Should there be styling options around content components, or do we keep it very minimalistic? So these are all things we have to take in mind to make sure we're actually giving content editors what they're needing. And so I've sort of alluded to the fact that Drupal is great for content strategy, but maybe it's not obvious why, or as well as I do, there's 100 different ways to use Drupal for any project. So how do you make sure that you're doing it the right way and that you are prioritizing content strategy as you're using Drupal? So I have some ideas about that. And I'm stealing this slide from the last DrupalCon, the Dries note that Dries presented. He talked a lot about, he talked about so many things, but one of the things he talked about was how do we prioritize what Drupal core should do? And he talked about these 4 fundamental capabilities that Drupal should give you out of the box, and that with these 4 things, Drupal is doing its job. It's maybe connecting to lots of other things. You're adding additional layers of functionality. You're adding integrations, but this is what Drupal's really good at. And this is, as a related fact, I think that is why we should be using it as opposed to something else. So content modeling. So when we think about Drupal, I think a lot of us started to use it because it has such a flexible content model that has content management features, but that doesn't just mean you're creating and editing and deleting content, but you're also able to create and edit, delete all of the structure around that content. And that's true with content types, but also, of course, views and layouts through the layout builder. And then we also have a lot of content authoring features. So one of the reasons I'm using Drupal is because when I started building websites, I just saw how much better it was at managing content in multiple languages. And that was a key thing that my clients needed. It's also good at revision tracking, and over the years, more things have been added, in the content moderation capabilities, as I said, have really made it stand out more. Content delivery is an interesting one, because as a Drupal themer, I would just take it for granted that, of course, we use the Drupal theme system. But now, of course, we can use Drupal in decoupled context. And so content delivery is core to how Drupal works, but that might not always look the same. That could be different on different projects. And then, of course, there's all these other things we might take for granted, but the user authentication system in Drupal, the fact that we have a system that actually logs errors and does caching and all these other core functions, that all is important to how Drupal works as well. And so in this context, when we're talking about improving content strategy and just making web publishing work better, how does Drupal's capabilities support this? So I think the most fundamental one is just that having structured content means that we can give content editors this control over translating content so it's great for users, but at the same time have a level of control more at the code level where we're ensuring accessibility and brand compliance. So when we're working on a project and we put together, like, here's the style guide, here's how everything's going to look, here's how we're going to meet the accessibility requirements for the project, we don't want content editors have to think about that every time they publish content. And so because Drupal has structured content, and even when you're creating a landing page that seems flexible, you can use blocks to do that, you can use paragraphs to do that, it means we can solve these problems about brand and brand consistency and accessibility. We can solve those more at the system level. So this is really important to creating a good, solid platform for content. But on top of that, we aren't limited in Drupal to just having content in, content out. We can also, in some cases, if we need to, take content from other sources. So a lot of you have probably are familiar with the migrate API because you've thought about Drupal 7 to 8 or 9 migration, and this is something that's come up. Okay, we need to migrate all of our content. We're going to use this thing called the migrate API. But the migrate API is also really useful for projects where you want to pull content in from another source. And so we can do that. We can say, like, okay, every night we're going to synchronize this content, and then it's going to become part of our Drupal platform. Or maybe that's going to happen every hour, every week. Maybe it's going to happen when we click a button. And this means that we can reduce this content duplication effect that happens sometimes when we're working with complex organizations. And we can say, okay, that content, the main version of it lives somewhere else, but then we're going to be pulling it in and manipulating it somehow in Drupal, maybe displaying it in the search UI, but also we could be adding metadata to it. We could be doing other things to make it more useful. On the content delivery side, I know some people are really excited. They go out there and say, okay, we're going to use React. Drupal can now be decoupled. This is fun for our developers, has all these advantages because we want to have the same templates that we use for our 5 different systems. So there's lots of reasons to go decoupled, but I think that sometimes we underestimate the value that Drupal templates bring. So the fact that we have these templates, these twig templates that we can leverage to deliver content, there's lots of little things that this does, like when we publish a website and we want to make sure that the metadata is optimized. or that we have schema.org information in our markup that then can be interpreted to show more useful Google search results. So this kind of content delivery, it goes beyond what we just see in the browser. You know, it also, content delivery also means what users see when they Google us, or what a screen reader interprets when it parses a web page. And so this type of content delivery, I think the benefit of using Drupal templates is that we can take advantage of a lot of non-visible optimizations that have been made at the template level. Another way we can think of content delivery is that there is sometimes this layer of functionality that happens between the content model and the content delivery. So we think, okay, we get all our content into Drupal, and then we have to have a way to print it out on the website. But as you know, if you've ever created a search interface in Drupal, you can use something called the Search API. And this actually allows us to build kind of a second content model on top of the basic one. It allows us to say, well, here's all the information we want to make searchable, and here's how it should be searchable. And then that gets used for content delivery. So, you know, Drupal has content modeling and content delivery and content authoring, but all of those things are really tightly connected and integrated in a way that means we get to control how content moves from one place to another. And that has this huge benefit on a lot of large scale projects. So this is a project for Tourism Quebec. It's a tourism website, but it's a government-based one. And it has tons of records, like every kind of touristic listing thing you can do, hotel, available in the province, and all of this information then gets parsed out and made available through search. And then, of course, with content delivery, as many of you know, we can also use content in other ways, way beyond the browser. So content can be delivered, for example, to through an API. And so one use case for this, a project that we worked on a few years ago, it involved, you know, a Drupal website with lots of content for the public, but it also involved a component where we wanted to create a similar set of content, you know, news and updates, but that was really secure and designed for staff. So employees of this organization, they wanted to get push notifications relevant to them when there was any major update that they had to be aware of. And this had to be really well tracked, installed on only certain devices. So it was delivered by an app, and we used push notifications. So basically took all the data that Drupal was managing, used all the same tools that content editors were used to using for publishing content, made sure that that was really designed to map to the information employees needed using taxonomy tools, and then provided that via React Native app. And of course, you could do the same thing with decoupled front end using React, but not in an app context. And I've heard of projects as well, though I've never done this, where data from Drupal that gets pushed out gets fed into Slack. And so you can kind of meet the employees where they are if they need to be getting these real-time updates. And of course, this could also be used for a public-facing interface. And one other use case I would mention for a more kind of ambitious content delivery where you're not using those Drupal core templates is a decoupled use case, but a hybrid one. So I do think there's this huge benefit, like I said, to using what Drupal core provides. So provides a lot of consistency. There's a lot of documentation written for how those things work. But sometimes you want to build something that's really interactive. And you think, okay, well, the easiest thing to do would be to create these React components just for this one thing. So one use case that I can think of is this interface for a university where there's different programs that students might be interested in, and they want to design their own program. So they're taking the data that Drupal provides. All of that is, managed using Drupal's content model, updated using Drupal's content authoring tools. But then the way it's delivered to those users is through this React component, so that they can take it and manipulate it and really quickly move it around, decide, I want to do this first. Here's some notes about why I want to take this course. And so that kind of adds this extra layer of interactivity that wouldn't say not possible, but certainly wouldn't be as fast or as easy to build as it was using this kind of decoupled approach. And finally, Drupal's content authoring. So I think sometimes we just take it for granted. Drupal has a content authoring interface. Of course, you can log in. And I think we take it for granted because if we're the ones building the website, we also use this interface to build. And we use this interface as developers to, look at how things work and configure and do all of that type of thing. But it is really, it's really not common that you have as much flexibility over the back end of a platform as the front end. And so the fact that we can completely customize the admin UI of Drupal and decide how we want things to be, decide the labels, decide the interface, and make improvements there. This has a great impact on your ability to create a content strategy platform, because the content authoring interface that you provide really affects the content that is going to come out on the front end. So for example, if you give authors the ability to reuse media and you give them a media library, that's great. Maybe they'll find some image and reuse it. But if you make that media library well tagged, you have some system to organize it, and you make it easier for people to find images or documents that have already been uploaded, they're way more likely to do that reuse. And so that's going to change then how much content duplication you have. It's going to change the types of media that these content authors find. And especially in a big kind of government context, this might be a huge win, because you might have so much content in your media library that it wouldn't really be possible to find otherwise. So I like talking about possibilities and all these exciting things that Drupal enables you to do this and that, but I also want to be really realistic and talk about challenges. So I'm just going to walk through a few of the things that I find that people struggle the most with, and that are kind of blockers for this vision of this great content strategy platform that just connects people and content in this amazing way. So what's hard? So first of all, flexibility is great. It's like the #1 reason people want to use Drupal, but it's also a big risk, because it can be it can be really hard to have a consistent platform when things are so flexible. So it's, there can just be too many options. Also, the flexibility of what Drupal can do means that people do things in different ways. So it leads to inconsistencies in how sites are set up. And even though we say, well, you can use Drupal to optimize your content strategy, but that takes time. It's not just going to happen instantly. It's not going to be optimized for your content strategy out of the box. So figuring out, well, what should my content moderation workflow look like? These are all decisions that you have to make. Standardization is also a problem. And sometimes this is a problem because, and I'm sure many of you have experienced this, we sort of think, oh yeah, our department's using Drupal, so therefore we're standardized on Drupal. And I think that's something I hear all the time. Oh yeah, we're all using the same system. But of course, there's more than one way to do things. So sometimes it results in the fact that you're all using the same system but there's very little overlap between the tools provided, the functionality, the look, how content publishing works from one system to another. And fixing that problem retroactively is hard. It's hard to find that common ground if you don't plan ahead. So then you lose out on some of the benefits of, you know, documenting things for content editors so that anyone in the organization knows how things work. So this is a big challenge. Personalization is always a challenge too. And I find, you know, we're always thinking, okay, we're government, our audience here, okay, we want to serve the public, we want to serve everyone, right? We want to serve all the residents of this place. And so that's our audience. But then of course, when we think a bit harder, there's so many types of personas that we are actually looking to target. And sometimes we're targeting this large public audience, but we also have a much smaller internal or more insider audience that knows us well. Maybe we're serving the public, but we're also serving people who are trying to get licenses to operate in a certain way, like the businesses and the business interests. And those people have very different needs. And so there's this desire to come in and say, okay, well, let's really personalize the content. So let's create two versions, one for the public and one for this more technical audience, this plain language version and then this super technical version. And then sometimes you end up with duplicate content. And this happens all the time on projects, that you have content variations that are set up because you're trying to serve everybody. And this is something that, you know, there's no magic wand you can wave and fix this problem. It's something you kind of have to plan out. So what's the content that's common and what really needs to be personalized? And do you have to rewrite it, or can you create just like a summary of the content and have that live within it? So there's ways around this, but I find personalization often leads to a lot of extra complexity. Legacy content is always a big issue. So many of you, maybe if it was a room, I'd say hands up, but like many of you probably have content that's been around for a decade or more. You have content that you maybe inherited when you took on your project that you know is there somewhere that still has a lot of HTML that was written by hand. Maybe it was migrated from somewhere else and never cleaned up. Or maybe you're just, you know, still allowing people to edit HTML and they're doing that because they want to get content to look a certain way. And so if you were trying to clean this up, this can take a lot of time, and it's not just taking a lot of time because it takes time to clean up handwritten HTML, but also because you have to change how content editors work to change this. And this kind of organizational change, if you're big, if you have lots of departments or lots of units that are kind of working in their own silos, this can be really challenging. And sometimes in government, we don't have the option of just saying, oh, we can take this down. This content isn't needed anymore, because sometimes we have a legal requirement to have certain types of content up there. And even making a small edit to the content has to go through a more kind of subject matter expert level review. And then finally, it can be hard to solve some of these problems because you're big and it's easier to iterate on small projects. So if you ever have the opportunity to say, okay, we have this one maybe smaller website we're trying to figure things out on, you might not put much time into that project, but think of it as an opportunity to adapt some best practices and show what can be done. Show how you can be more strategic in how you use content, or how if you enable content editors, you get better results. Whatever kind of challenge you're trying to tackle, look for these small projects you can iterate on to make improvements. So let's see how much time I have left. Somehow I don't see the time.
Have about 15 minutes.
Okay, so I'll cover a few more things, but I won't leave time for questions. I want to leave off on a bit more positive, like what you can do next kind of note. So one thing I suggest, if you don't know where to start, is just to get content people more involved. So if you might be a content person, so maybe I'm talking to the people who are need to be involved more and asked more. But I find that, if you're running a user experience workshop, if you're doing discovery for a new project, if you're trying to get some ideas around improving content structure, talk to the content experts, so content editors, but also subject matter experts and people who think about this stuff. I also find documentation is a great tool, and sometimes you think, oh, documentation, oh yeah, we have some documentation somewhere, or maybe you don't have any and you don't know where to start, but I find a lot of times there's documentation that's written for content editors, and it's just written to say, here's how to use Drupal, like here's how to log in, here's how to create a certain type of content, but it doesn't really connect it back to the strategy, like why would I use this content type or that one, or why would I use this paragraph type if I'm building a landing page versus something else. So having actual examples in your documentation is really helpful, and just saying, here's why you would use this in this context in our org, like this is why you should do this or that. The governance piece, so I already mentioned having a governance plan. You might also have, it might be too complex to fit everything into one spreadsheet. I love having this big spreadsheet that just says there's a row for every type of content that's pretty granular, and then here's who does what, here's who approves, here's how often it has to be updated, here's how we analyze the content, just getting it all in there. And then maybe that can go along sometimes with an editorial calendar if you've got lots of dates and moving pieces. And that's usually the hard part. And then building this stuff into Drupal, like saying, oh, let's just have a view to list content in a certain state, or to make sure we know it's being scheduled, or to just set up the roles and permissions. This part tends to be easier if everybody knows what the content governance plan is. And then investing in cleaning up legacy content, like this is an investment. If you have this kind of HTML content lying around, try to take on this project when you have the opportunity. So if you're still, maybe there's some people here are still thinking, oh yeah, we still have to migrate from Drupal 7 to 9, or maybe now Drupal 7 to 10. And so at this point, if you still have this kind of legacy content, take that project as an opportunity to try to clean it up. It can be an easier thing to tackle as you migrate, because you can do things in bulk. And then I also want to give a few pieces of advice, just because I know in government sometimes we feel like, oh, it's not my role to fix this problem, but I know this is a problem. And I want people to feel empowered more. So here's some advice from that perspective. So if you're, if you're a content editor, if you're a web publisher, if that's sort of part of your role, you work with content, of course, learning about what your platform offers and all the different types of content and the metadata that you have is good. It's also good to think about how that content is used beyond the page you're editing. So that content delivery part where we think, well, how does this content look in search results, or where is it used in the on-site search or search listings? Like just getting an awareness of that context is helpful, because it can help you kind of think outside of just the browser we usually think of. And then there's also probably something that you can do to create a style guide for content or usage guidelines that can serve as the starting point for change. So you can think, well, what are we doing now? What do we do that's common? Like what best practices are we already following? And then like, what do we wish we had? what do we wish was in that style guide or those usage guidelines that we're missing because we don't have enough content structure, or we don't have enough building blocks. And then look for content patterns that could be standardized. So I think content folks know more than anyone what could be turned into some components or what could be turned into building blocks that are going to be easier to maintain as accessible content. So that's something you could also help with, because I think identifying those is so time consuming, but if you know the content, you're going to be able to spot them. If you're a Drupal developer, so learning best practices, learning Drupal more, just learning what's possible, thinking more deliberately about content structure. I think sometimes we just think, okay, how do I make this look like the wireframe? But thinking more about how it affects the content strategy and the content editing process. This can be a good thing to build into your development process as well. And then best practices within your team and maybe contribution beyond your team. Like, are there other departments? Are there other people that are working in the system that are doing similar things? And how can you create more standardization across? And then if you're more in a leadership position, if you're a project manager, if you're kind of making decisions, then there's lots you can do. You can learn about content publishing models, sometimes from other people, so like case studies, just figuring out how do other people solve these problems, giving your team training, giving people time to think about standardization and to think about governance. This is really helpful. And then if you don't have a digital strategist who can help you plan ahead and plan for some of these longer term, like how do we improve the legacy content or the stuff that we're ignoring, that can be something to consider as well. So lots of leadership things that you can do to help you get there. So that's all the content I have. I hope there's some questions.
Yes,
I'm excited to hear.
There are some questions.
And just before we get there, I'll just put this up on the screen. There's my colleague Parina, who's on the line with me, runs our Drupal training program, and we have some courses coming up that might be of interest. There's a migration workshop, and then a whole set of tracks for learning Drupal from A to Z starting in September.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So the first question by Brian is, can you make any comment on team size in order to support these scale of projects?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. When I look at teams, I mean, there's usually a team that comes in discovery to help really guide some of this work. So whenever I'm working on discovery, I always try to get a content strategist involved. It might be the same person as a user experience designer, but somebody with that mindset who's going to think about the content. So whatever size of team you have, having that extra role there is worth adding the person for. And then otherwise in discovery, you're probably going to have, it's worthwhile also to have a technical person working alongside that more strategic discovery. So having somebody who knows Drupal, assuming you're using Drupal, who can say, this is what's feasible, this is what the content model supports, and having time for those people to work together, not siloed, that's really beneficial. And then moving into more like of a development phase, design development, you know, you might have 2 designers, you might have 5 people doing development, QA. So a project that has 10 people, like that's pretty normal. I'd say bigger than 10 people, you're starting to get into some inefficiencies because you have to have people playing, you know, people sharing the workload or people kind of having to collaborate a lot on the exact same tasks. And so it can be harder to build that consistency. But I've also worked in projects on government where there's like this project team, but then maybe there's also kind of a central team that's giving feedback and saying, well, this is what the brand guidelines say, and kind of doing an audit on accessibility or getting input from other people in the organization saying like, this is what the best practice is. So that's also pretty common to have kind of a team, but then a central team that they report to.
Okay, the next question by Josh is, can you speak to access control solutions? Often in large websites for organizations, we have the problem of multiple content stakeholders and reviewers. Do you see a need for a dozen roles, or does it make sense to build per user per piece of content permission?
That's a really good question. I have had not that much success with systems where you have to say, oh, well, this one person has to approve this, so then we're going to assign it to them, and then they're just going to log in to approve this one thing. I find that really hard to maintain. You know, it means that everybody has to know exactly who has to approve each thing, and then sometimes people just end up not using the access control properly, and they just say, oh, we'll just use my password, or we'll just give everybody an admin access, and that's the worst. There is a module, and I wish I thought of the name, have the name right at the top of my head, but there's a module that just gives you a preview link for content, and it's an obfuscated URL, so it's not something you're going to guess, but it would allow somebody to just see that one, preview that one page without logging in. And so for stakeholders who are only really interested in a couple pieces of content on the site, I find that is a really good way to give them that access. And then, you know, it's an offline thing, but they can just say, yes, I approve, sort of via email. That's another approach. I wouldn't suggest having like 20 roles. Keep in mind that you can have granular roles. So you can assign, well, yeah, you can have granular roles, but you can also assign people more than one role. So you can say, all of you people have access to this content type, but you can also be in another role that gives you access to a second content type. And that's a way of creating more granularity. And then there are websites that also use like the group module to manage access control, to say this group of people is responsible for this group of content. But I think you have to think long and hard about whether that's worth it if you really have that type of structure that that warrants setting up all of that additional configuration.
So yeah, I'm looking at moderating the comments, and I think people are asking, what module is that? And would something like this help for group module help? Wait, would something like the group module help for that? You mentioned that.
Yeah. The name of the module is something like link preview.
Ralph, I think he posted a preview link.
Yeah, it's got to be that.
Just got another question in. Do you have any more tips for using Drupal as a reluctant collaborative publishing platform? Despite our efforts, our SMEs always want to do their group editing and approvals once it's on the web page instead of before.
Yeah, I find that hard because especially if you're using something like paragraphs or you're using layout builder, it gets quite visual. So it is hard to really sign off on something before it's like it looks like it's going to look, because there's this approval that you're doing that's more based on the appearance than just on the text. So I feel like I've lost. Yeah. So I find that is a challenge that I've seen too. And so I think it's something you can kind of take into well, at least it's a good thing to acknowledge in your content governance plan that, okay, there's this offline process maybe for initially authoring the content, and then there's this approval that has to happen once it's on the website, and maybe both of those things have to happen. So if you're trying to get people more to just use Drupal and not to use external tools for moderation, I think having better previewing tools is going to be helpful, and trying to design a moderation workflow that's not too complicated, so people can actually figure it out, giving people some dashboards so they see at a glance, this is what I've got to look at, this is what I've got to pay attention to. I think that's going to help too.
Well, thank you, Suzanne, for taking the time out of your day. Such a useful topic, and I appreciate it. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a pleasure. I'm glad all of you could come. It's great to see such a big group out. And I'm going to go have a glass of iced tea now because it's quite warm here. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too. Thank you again.
Okay,
Take care, everybody.